Chapter 1. The Red Tape. Eivelyn Hart returned to Snowbound Pack a little before mid-afternoon, when the winter sun made the snow look far too clean for a place stained by debt, lies, and old blood. Hart Lodge was still beautiful from a distance, with its dark timber beams, wide windows reflecting the mountains, and chimneys sketching pale smoke against the hard Colorado sky. But Eivelyn knew the difference between beauty and health. Beautiful things rot too, and the ones that rot in silence are usually the most dangerous. The front desk smelled of pine, mulled wine, and caution. Half the staff pretended not to watch her. The other half watched without pretending. The dead owner's daughter was back to take over a sinking lodge, and Snowbound Pack had always treated other people's tragedies like a social sport. Mabel lifted her face the moment she saw Eivelyn walk in, already armed with messages from the bank, the lawyer, and the wrong man. "The bank wants confirmation for tomorrow's meeting," she said. "They'll get confirmation. Mr. Silas Mercer sent flowers. Throw them out." Mabel almost smiled. Gladly, Eivelyn crossed the lobby without heading upstairs to the new office the board had prepared for her. She had not come back to this mountain to sit in some antiseptic room with no memory. She went straight to her father's old office, where the wall clock was still dead and the green lamp still leaned crooked in the same corner as always. The smell was the same: cedar, paper, worn leather, and a trace of smoke that seemed to have refused to leave even after William Hart's death. In the third desk drawer, jammed shut by years of stubbornness, she found a small black recorder, almost invisible beneath the dust. When she picked it up, she felt the weight of the past in her palm. William used it to record ideas when he did not trust anyone around him, which in Snowbound Pack, she knew now, must have meant almost all the time. A red light blinked on when she ran her finger along the side. Her heart missed a beat. She pressed play. After the static, her father's voice filled the room. Rough, tired, far too familiar. "If you're hearing this, Eivelyn, it means I did not fall." Her legs locked. All the air in the office seemed to disappear. William said they had tried to force him to sign over the lodge to the pack. It was not figurative language. Snowbound Pack was, in fact, a territory ruled by werewolves, a mosaic of old packs, winter roots, borders tailored by modern contracts and ancient instincts. Hart Lodge had been built on ground that connected passage, prestige, and money. William Hart had resisted that greed for years, but now he sounded like a man running out of time. On the recording, he took a breath and added that too many people were pretending to protect him. Then came footsteps on wood, the sound of a door opening, and the sentence that would stay lodged in Evelyn's mind for days. "Eivelyn, the man you think is going to protect you is the one who is silence." She listened to the tape two more times, now paying attention to the shift in her father's breathing, the scrape of boots, the real fear of someone who had realized another person was in the room. William had not slipped on any trail. He had been cornered, possibly sedated, certainly pressured, and most likely killed. That was when Graham Voss appeared in the doorway. The son of the former alpha of the Voss pack filled the frame as if the wood had been cut for him. Graphite coat wet with snow, short beard, shoulders too broad to go unnoticed, and gray eyes that never asked permission from anything. His presence carried the mark of alphas. Not some dramatic transformation, but a pressure in the air. A sense that the room registered the wolf before it registered the man. "So you really came back," he said. Eivelyn closed her hand around the recorder. "Did you come to welcome me or inspect my drawers?" Graham said the South Road had been closed and that she should not stay alone in that office. The word "should" irritated her instantly. It was not care. It was authority wrapped in caution. And worse, her own body registered his presence with offensive clarity. The clean scent of snow, wool, and pine. The brutal warmth banked beneath his coat. The way he seemed to take up too much space without any effort at all. I did not inherit orders along with the lodge, she cut in. It's not an order. It's a warning. In your mouth. There's very little difference. Before the argument could get worse, Noah appeared in the hallway with his usual stripped-down practicality. Unlike Graham, Noah did not arrive like an alpha. He arrived like a sentinel. He was also a werewolf, a man with a sharp sense of scent, absolute discipline, and trained silence. He reported that the cameras in the administrative corridor had gone blind for 7 minutes, and that two locks had been manually reset with no named log entry. Eivelyn demanded a list of everyone who had passed through the wing. Graham asked who had gone in. Noah answered her first, not him. And that alone was enough for Eivelyn to note the existence of some fracture between the two men. After they left, she hid the recorder in the bottom drawer and wrote down 3 words on a notepad. Pack, transfer, protector. She worked for less than half an hour, trying to turn terror into method, until she realized she needed coffee. When she came back, the door was exactly as she had left it. But the bottom drawer stood slightly open. The receipt box had been moved. The notepad with her notes had shifted. The recorder was gone. On the old carpet, wet footprints led from the door to the desk and back out into the hall. Someone had learned about the tape within minutes. Someone had stolen it before Eivelyn could understand what her father had tried to leave her, and in that instant, grief stopped being only absence. It became an answer. It became war. Chapter 2. Snow beneath the skin. The next morning, Snowbound looked like an indecent postcard. The sky too blue, the snow too bright, the guests too cheerful for a place whose heart was rotting in silence. Eivelyn had been awake since 5, not out of discipline, but because every time she closed her eyes she heard her father's voice saying he had not fallen, and then saw the empty drawer and the stolen recorder only hours after finding it. She began inspecting the lodge on foot. Lobby, kitchen, premium wing, spa, boiler room, cabins, ski lifts, service dock, utility carters. She wanted to see everything with her own eyes, without the cowardly filter of polished spreadsheets. The picture worsened with every section. Bulbs replaced with cheaper versions, preventive maintenance delayed, discreet water damage, inventory below standard, and too many small mistakes concentrated in exactly the right places. It was intelligent sabotage, designed to reduce value without provoking immediate collapse. Into corridors of the north wing, for example, someone had replaced warm bulbs with cold, cheaper ones, a detail small enough to pass as ordinary cost-cutting, but effective enough to steal the sense of luxury from the place. In the boiler room, there were maintenance records entered in an order that was far too perfect, as if someone had filled out the logs thinking more about future cover than real work. Even the main restaurant's inventory showed the same pattern. Premium bottles missing, discrepancies in stock entries, slow replenishment during the most critical weeks. Nothing blatant. Everything intelligent, everything expensive to fix and easy to deny. Eivelyn kept taking notes as she walked, and in more than one place she caught glances that were too quick from employees who had known the lodge for years. The problem was not only in the walls. It was in people who knew exactly where to press to create where, without bringing the building down all at once. The realization made her colder. Real ruin never comes only from the outside. Caleb appeared with 2 mugs of coffee and a smile that always seemed to arrive half a second before the impertinence. He was a wolf too. but of a different social species. Less hierarchy, more movement. Less territory, more improvisation. Blue eyes, brown hair always a little messy, and that dangerous energy of people who use humor as camouflage for constant attention. "You're going to wear through your boots before noon," he said, handing her a mug. "I don't take drinks from men who appear out of nowhere." "Excellent. This one's from an employee deeply committed to chaos." She took a sip. More to deny him the satisfaction of a refusal than out of trust. Caleb looked over the lodge with a slight tilt of his head, as if he could scent the pretty surface and the rot underneath it. "They closed the west trail early this morning without notifying management," he said. "Ask the man who thinks the mountain comes with a last name. Graham, of course." Eivelyn found him at the base of the lifts, giving orders to the patrol. Out in the open cold, his lupine nature seemed even more visible, not in the form of transformation, but in the control of space. The patrolmen listened to him as if the air around him required it. Graham said the trail had been closed, landslide risk. Eivelyn shot back that the lodge should have been warned. "First, the mountain doesn't answer to letterhead," he said, "and the lodge doesn't answer to a bad-tempered male's territorial instinct." The argument heated immediately. Graham said certain parts of the mountain became dangerous when someone started digging into the past. The way he said it did not sound like metaphor. It sounded like fact. Something at the back of Evelyn's neck stiffened, but she would not give him the satisfaction of showing it. She went back into the main building and headed straight for the monitoring room. Noah was waiting with a tablet, jaw tight and the infuriating caution of someone who preferred certainty before alarming anyone. He showed her the logs. 3 locks had been manually reset between 11 and 1 the previous day. There were also records of 2 master cards used out of context and a partial image of Liam Firth, an old maintenance technician, crossing the service dock at a time he should not have been there. "In the hall outside your room last night. Someone stood there for almost 2 minutes, Noah added. "Didn't knock." The sentence chilled more than the air. He wanted to reinforce the wing, place discreet security, alter patterns. Eivelyn refused the idea of a guard at her door, but agreed to let him tighten circulation without spreading panic. Noah had the kind of protection that did not ask permission, and that irritated and reassured her in equal measure. Later, in the spa corridor, Ethan was tending to the twisted ankle of an employee who had slipped near the boiler room. Ethan was the 4th man orbiting the lodge's war, and he too was a werewolf. The difference was that in him, his wolf nature manifested less as threat and more as a warm, steady, almost healing presence. A doctor, a healer in the mountain tradition. He had sure hands, attentive eyes behind glasses, and the rare ability to touch someone without making the gesture feel like possession. The floor felt strange, the employee murmured, like someone left a valve open. Ethan looked up at Eivelyn. Strange like an accident or strange like intent. "I'm starting to hate that word," she said. He smiled slightly. "Then let's use another one. Pattern." Later that same morning, Mabel handed Eivelyn an elegant box sent by Silas Mercer. Inside was a rare wine, 2 glasses, and a note suggesting they meet to discuss a real solution. Silas showed up in person shortly after, as if he already knew expensive objects paid off better when accompanied by their owner. If Graham carried the force of a mountain alpha, and Noah the firmness of a sentinel, Silas was the wolf who had learned to use tailored suits, financial counsel, and polished smiles instead of bared teeth. The Mercer clan still carried wolf blood, but had traded the display of brute power for capital, influence, and predatory patience. The animal was still there. Eivelyn felt it in the way he assessed the room, the exits, and the value of every person before he spoke. Silas offered to buy part of the debt, stabilize cash flow, and preserve the Hart name on the front of the building. He spoke of interest, never charity. Eivelyn let him talk and quickly realized the man knew far too much about the lodge's operational deficits for someone who did not yet have official access to the numbers. The market talks, he said. The market usually doesn't mention small vendor liabilities and corrective maintenance costs. He only smiled, but not fast enough to hide that he had heard the accusation in full. The afternoon went on with more friction and small discoveries, until Noah found an old folder mixed in with outdated maps in the storage room. There was an old drawing of the property marked in William Hart's hand. A cabin on the northeast slope was circled twice. On the back, in smaller letters, there was a sentence that felt like it ran straight through Evelyn's spine. "Do not hand the keys to the winter man." She folded the map slowly. At that point, she no longer knew whether her father was talking about the lodge, her heart, or the sum of both. Chapter 3. The Sealed Cabin. The next morning, Eivelyn decided to go up to the cabin alone. She took her phone, a flashlight, a pocket knife, the map, and enough stubbornness to dismiss any escort. The northeast trail cut through the less glamorous side of the mountain, through tall pines, brittle ice, and a bad kind of silence. The kind that makes the body understand danger before the mind organizes arguments. Halfway up, Noah called. His tone was dry, but the concern sat whole beneath it. "Where are you?" "Out for a walk, Eivelyn, on the northeast trail." His silence lasted half a second, and that alone was an answer. "If you're going to the cabin, don't go in without me." That made her stop. "How do you know about the cabin?" "Because your father had that place sealed years ago." "Give me 5 minutes." She hung up before he could turn advice into an order that did not help much. Soon after, Graham appeared on the trail as if the mountain itself had pushed him out of the snow. The cold seemed to cling to him better than to any other man. His gray gaze found hers with that calm firmness that always made her want to bite before yielding an inch. "You shouldn't be here. You people keep repeating that like it's the local anthem." Graham saw the map in her inner pocket and guessed the cabin without her saying anything. He spoke of instability in the mountain, of buried things that should not be disturbed, of old risks tied to the pack. Eivelyn answered the way she always did with men who tried to protect her by halves. With sharp irony and total resistance, Noah appeared shortly after. So in less than 10 minutes, the three of them stood facing the same destination, and the entire mountain seemed to tighten its breath around them. Noah wanted her to go back. Graham did too. Eivelyn made it clear she would step into that cabin with or without them, and if they wanted to come along, they would do it without taking the lead in her own story. The cabin emerged among the pines, smaller and older than she had imagined. Darkened wood, boarded windows, roof heavy with snow. The door was chained shut, but Noah spotted recent marks on the metal. Someone had already been there. Graham yanked the locking pin free with a motion too precise to look improvised. Eivelyn went in first. Inside, the smell of damp wood, soot, and recent presents wrapped around her immediately. Noah scented the air before he even spoke, an involuntary gesture that made him look more wolf than man for a second. Graham did the same, though with less evidence. Caleb, when he arrived later, laughed softly and said the place smelled like stored fear and bad coffee, which was probably the best possible definition for any hideout used by intelligent people under pressure. On one side wall, a carved symbol looked as if it had been hastily scraped away. Eivelyn saw Graham recognize it before he said anything. It was the mark of an old Voss bloodline, a territorial seal used when agreements were still sworn in wood, blood, and promises spoken under moonlight. The fact that the mark was there made the cabin less archive and more proof that the mountain's past had never really left the stage. There were fresh boot marks, scraps of burned paper, and the ancient symbol carved into the wall, nearly erased. Graham recognized it as belonging to a specific pack line, but did not want to elaborate. Noah took in the room like a man trained to measure escape routes before emotion. Eivelyn, for her part, understood only that everyone on that mountain knew some piece of the puzzle before she did. A floorboard sounded different beneath her left foot. Noah found the compartment, but it was Caleb, arriving in the doorway with terrible and perfect timing. Who found the exact point to pry the board loose? "You make an alarmingly dramatic group for an old cabin," he commented. Crouching beside them inside the compartment was a thin folder, 2 metal tins, and documents protected by thick plastic. Eivelyn opened everything at once. The papers showed bank transfers, partial names, accounts, and intermediaries connected to the financial siege around the lodge. On the final page, dated only a few days before her father's death, appeared a witness signature. Noah, the word hurt like it had teeth. She lifted the paper. "Cold. Do you want to explain why your name is on this?" Noah said he could, but his answer was interrupted by the first crack from outside. Then another, closer. Graham was already on his feet when the mountain hit the cabin. It was not a full avalanche, but a short, brutal slide, far too precise to feel natural. Dust fell from the ceiling. The wall groaned. Eivelyn shoved the folder beneath her coat, and for the first time, urgency drowned out the argument. There was a small maintenance window at the back. Noah found it. Graham tore off the pins. Caleb helped Eivelyn through. The snow outside was thigh-deep, and the cabin's front door had already been pinned shut by the white mass that had dropped from the slope. Noah studied the groove left by the slide and narrowed his eyes. Too narrow a line. It may have been triggered. Eivelyn did not like agreeing with anyone else's lupine instincts, but there the conclusion was unavoidable. Whoever had been following her movements was reacting far too fast. On the way down, she demanded an explanation about Noah's signature. He told her William Hart had called him years earlier to review the lodge's security. On the night the transfer had been discussed, Noah had been there as a neutral witness. The problem was that in addition to William and the official representatives, Arthur Voss had also shown up, Graham's father. Noah said he had signed to attest that the meeting took place, not to legitimize what had been demanded. He also said William had left marginal notes on the copy, and beside Noah's name had written, "Reliable, but watched." It did not absolve Noah, but it shoved him into a gray zone Eivelyn had already learned to hate even more. When they reached the lodge, another act of sabotage was already waiting. A spa guest had slipped on the side staircase. Ethan was tending the woman's ankle with the precise calm of someone who had seen too much pain to be impressed by screams. Her husband was talking about negligence, lawsuits, and social media. Noah found an oily substance on the last step that did not belong in the spa. Caleb informed them the rumor was already circulating through the village. Later, Ethan gave Eivelyn an envelope found among her father's old records. Inside was a short, cruel sentence. He wasn't only afraid of dying, he was afraid of who you would choose afterward. The message followed her for the rest of the day, as if her father had left her, along with grief, the obligation to distrust any masculine shelter around her. Chapter 4. The Price of Shelter. Late that afternoon, Mabel appeared to say Silas Mercer's car was waiting for her. Eivelyn almost refused, but decided to go. She needed to hear the man up close, on his own ground. Now that the cabin had confirmed the siege was coming from outside and inside, she went to the village's panoramic restaurant without dressing up to please him. Cream sweater, boots, hair tied back without effort. If Silas wanted theater, he would get content, not costume. He was waiting by the windows with the snow-covered valley behind him as if the landscape itself were paying him homage. Silas offered a solution again. He said the lodge would not survive another 2 weeks without a cash injection, that the banks were growing restless, that smaller vendors would begin pressing, that the local press was already scenting blood. He spoke with the serenity of a wolf accustomed to hunting without running. "I can preserve the Hart name on the facade," he said. "How generous," she replied. "You steal the house and leave me the sign." He smiled with venomous patience. "I leave survival." The conversation wound through cash flow, restructuring, creditors, equity participation, and underneath everything, possession. Silas knew too many details and stepped back every time Eivelyn tried to force him to admit where that knowledge came from. At one point, he referred to Arthur Voss as a problem for William Hart, which once again proved an intimacy he should not have had with the background of her father's death. When the conversation began to sharpen too much, Caleb appeared in the restaurant and sat beside them without invitation, guilt, or any talent for ceremony. He turned the table into an entertaining minefield. He called Silas's offer a predatory clause dressed in good tailoring. Silas treated him like a distraction. Caleb fired back by suggesting that any man too rich and too polite in a winter restaurant deserved inspection for moral smuggling. At the end, Eivelyn stepped outside with Caleb, where fine snow fell over the parking lot. The view of the lit village was beautiful enough to annoy her. "He scares me," she admitted. "Not in the simple way." Caleb moved a little closer without invading. "In the way the cage comes with heating and expensive wine." She looked at him with brief surprise. Caleb met her gaze without a joke. He said he did not want to be seen only as the fun wolf in the story, or as the lighter alternative compared to the mountain's heavier men. There was something sincere in that, and sincerity in Snowbound Pack was worth more than gold. The closeness between them deepened at exactly the moment a lodge car pulled up beside the restaurant. The person who got out was not a driver, it was Graham. He reprimanded her for going out alone with Silas, fell back into talk of risk, target, recklessness. Eivelyn was already too exhausted to endure any man trying to define the limits of her fear. Graham said she would not go out alone with Mercer again. That was enough. Eivelyn grabbed Caleb by the coat and kissed him right there under the falling snow, not only to wound Graham's pride, but because the impulse found easy ground. Caleb responded at once, warm, alive, with a care that disarmed the purely strategic intent of the gesture. The kiss shortened the air between them and made the scene more dangerous. On the drive back to the lodge, Graham said nothing. Eivelyn hated him for that almost as much as she hated herself for still tasting Caleb on her mouth. The car felt too small for the silence between them. There was anger, jealousy, pride, and something worse. The realization that Graham had hurt her less by what he said than by the ease with which he seemed to believe he had some authority over her body and her risks. When they pulled into the lodge parking lot, he finally spoke. "Mercer doesn't want you. He wants the right signature at the moment you're most tired." Eivelyn replied that did not give him the right to police her. Graham shot back that he was not policing her, only trying to stop her from becoming the kind of bait men like Silas use to pull the rest of the trap shut. Neither of them came out of that conversation looking better. Neither of them came back inside less tense. When she entered her room, she found clear signs of intrusion. Bedspread displaced, closet half open, drawer left ajar. Her father's watch gone from the dresser. She found it inside the closet, on the floor, with the back panel loosened. Inside was a hidden compartment, a tiny key, and a folded piece of paper. Crypt. This time the intrusion did not feel like theft. It felt like a message. Someone had gone through her room to show they remained close enough to violate not only her belongings, but the rhythm of her discoveries. Or perhaps, Eivelyn thought, close enough to guide her. She stood in the room for a long time after reading the word, listening to the heating click inside the walls and trying to decide which part of her exhaustion was fear and which part had already become fury. Caleb's kiss still burned in her body's memory. Graham still occupied too much space in her mind. Noah had still signed documents from the past, and Ethan appeared in every memory tied to care, which in that context could also be a trap. Her father's note returned whole. He wasn't only afraid of dying. He was afraid of who she would choose afterward. If William had written that, it was because he knew the siege would not be only financial. It would be emotional. The men around her were not decorative. They were lines of force inside the board. Eivelyn locked the door, pressed her forehead briefly against the wood, and thought about that damned phrase. The Winter Man. Graham came to mind first, inevitably. He was Alpha. He was Voss. He was the mountain in the shape of a man. And he wore the cold as if winter recognized him. Silas came right behind him, because there's a colder cold than snow. The cold of men who smile while calculating what they can take. Noah entered the calculation too, not out of cruelty, but because in Snowbound Pack, too much protection could mean surveillance by another name. Even Caleb, who seemed the lightest, knew too much at the wrong hours. The conclusion irritated her even more. Her father had died leaving clues, but had not spared his daughter the task of deciding which wolves still deserved to be near her. She turned the tiny key between her fingers, felt the cold metal, and understood that the crypt would not be just another hiding place. It would be the point where past and present stopped pretending they did not know each other. And if someone had gone through her room only to lead her there, then that person also believed she would walk this path. The question was no longer whether she was being watched. It was by whom, and with what expectation. Chapter 5. Beneath the White Chapel. A little after midnight, Eivelyn gave up pretending sleep was possible. She took the key, flashlight, and phone and slipped down the service stairs toward the mountain's old white chapel. If there was a crypt, it would be there. The cold met her like a clean blade. The chapel rose among the pines, small, silent, almost sacred from a distance. Before she reached the door, she heard footsteps behind her. She did not need to turn to know. Graham had followed her. When she showed him the key hidden inside her father's watch and revealed the word crypt, he did not bother faking complete surprise. He admitted he had heard rumors about a compartment beneath the chapel, used in old times to store documents the pack could not leave in plain sight. Eivelyn accused him of always knowing too much too late. Graham answered that he was going with her whether she liked it or not. There was an almost invisible carving in the altar. The key fit there. A dry click triggered an old mechanism, and a stone slab beside it shifted, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The underground space smelled of dust, damp stone, iron, and old paper. It was not a religious crypt, but a hiding place. William Hart had stored metal boxes, folders, receipts, draft contracts, and a larger recorder there. The discovery that her father had turned the chapel into a war vault hit Eivelyn with the force of an intimate offense. He had hidden all of that near her for years in a box stamped with Mercer Holdings. She found payments, intermediaries, shell companies, and a short note from her father that closed her fist from the inside. Mercer financed the witness. Another folder held territorial transfer drafts, high route maps, and notary receipts. There was also a list of companies with names too generic to be honest, each tied to a different segment of the siege. One bought debt, another absorbed supply, another appeared linked to maintenance contracts it never fulfilled. William had spent months collecting enough crumbs to prove the lodge's ruin had been designed as an operation, not bad luck. Eivelyn felt her stomach turn as she grasped the extent of the paranoia required to survive on that mountain. Her father had hidden documents beneath a chapel, left messages inside a watch, recorded tapes, duplicated contracts, and still died before tying the final knot. If that was not war, nothing else deserved the name. There was also, at the bottom of one box, a personal receipt signed by a notary who had died 2 years earlier. William had written in the margin, "Died too early." The sentence made the underground room feel even smaller, as though the dead were already gathering there before the investigation was even finished. Another folder held more territorial drafts, high route maps, and notary receipts. Graham, looking over her shoulder, recognized names connected to the old Voss Pack Council. Family weight. In that place, smelled like mold and dried blood. Eivelyn switched on the recorder. Her father's voice came through the static, more tired than on the first tape. William said he had not trusted a single path. Arthur Voss wanted the lodge for the territory. Mercer wanted it for financial control. The two men pretended they were fighting over different things, but they bled on the same paper. Then came the part that truly cut. William said he had agreed to meet in secret, not Arthur, but Arthur's son, Graham. He said Graham had promised to try to separate the land from the pact, to build a new agreement, to keep the pack away from the lodge until William could reorganize the debt. There was no absolute faith in the account, only cautious hope. William acknowledged that Graham did not speak like Arthur, nor display the same inherited hunger. Still, her father also made it clear that he did not trust enough to rest in that hope. When the recording ended, Eivelyn turned toward the man beside her. Graham admitted everything. He had told William he would try to protect the lodge from his father's pressure, but he had failed. At that time, he had not yet been alpha. He did not control the pack council. He only fought, from inside, the inheritance of a man who confused tradition with entitlement. He said he had tried to isolate the territorial demand from the economic plunder, and had arrived too late. The truth deepened Evelyn's anger, but it also destroyed the possibility of going on seeing Graham only as a threat. He had been inside the story, wrong, silent, insufficient, but not in the simple role of villain. Maybe that was exactly what William had meant when he spoke of the man chosen to look guilty. Graham did not try to touch her right away. He simply stayed too close, as if proximity itself were a kind of calculated risk. He said that back then he still had not commanded the pack, but was already fighting Arthur in everything connected to the lodge. He admitted he had come to the crypt more than once with William. He admitted he had believed, arrogantly, that he could buy enough time to neutralize Mercer and bend his father. He failed at both. The word came out of his mouth like a sentence and an old wound. The underground chamber felt too small for that much tension. The chill of the stone contrasted with Graham's body heat, the scent of damp wool and pine, the way his eyes watched her without looking away. The underground space also held smaller signs, and perhaps because of that, more painful ones, that William had spent his final months in a permanent state of siege. There was an old mug forgotten in a corner, a gray scarf folded on a shelf, and 2 candles burned all the way down, as if her father had spent hours there reading, listening to footsteps above. trying to guess which of the men around him would step wrong first. Eivelyn brushed her fingers over the scarf's fabric and felt a silent violence growing in her chest. William had not died only because he refused a contract. He died because he had been turned into prey inside his own house. Maybe that was why the kiss with Graham came with so much anger. It was not only accumulated desire, though that was there too. It was her body responding to the fact that the wrong man's son was still, even then, the only one who knew the exact depth of that secret and did not retreat from her. Graham held her like a man who knew too much power spoiled everything if it came at the wrong time. When they pulled apart, both breathing hard among stone, dust, and cassette tape, Eivelyn felt with offensive clarity that the problem with him was not only his name. It was the fact that her body kept distinguishing something in him that was different from Arthur's legacy. She broke first. Eivelyn grabbed him by the coat. Graham kissed her like a man who had spent too much time controlling everything. The kiss was hard, hot, stripped of useless delicacy, and it left her more disordered than she wanted to admit. She barely had time to recover her breath. First she caught the smell. Then came the cracks of smoke. They ran up the stairs. By the time they pushed the passage open, the chapel was already on fire. It was no accident. Someone had waited for Eivelyn to find the crypt, go down into it, and then set the place ablaze to destroy the rest. Flames raced through the curtains and beams. Graham yanked her away from a section of ceiling that came down in sparks, broke open the sacristy's side exit, and the two of them threw themselves into the snow, kneeling outside. Eivelyn opened the folder she had saved from the hiding place. The last page, charred at the edges, still held one name clearly enough to haunt her until dawn: Voss. The surname of the man who had coerced her father was the same as the man who had just kissed her and dragged her out of the fire. Chapter 6. Icefall. They spent the night in the old office rereading everything the chapel had failed to destroy. When Graham appeared in the morning, coatless, exhausted and rigid, Eivelyn met him with every bit of anger she had left. The name Voss on the papers weighed even more now because it was tangled up with what she had felt in the crypt. Graham explained what was missing. The lodge occupied a sensitive point between high roots, winter passage, and old areas once claimed by the Voss pack. Arthur had treated that as a symbol of lupine leadership. Mercer, on the other hand, had seen in that same conflict a perfect financial entry point. Where Arthur saw inheritance, Silas saw concession and indirect control. My father wanted the lodge for the territory. Mercer wanted it for the profit. I saw a stupid war, Graham said. He did not try to absolve his own name. He admitted he knew the crypt existed, that he had been there twice with William, and that he had tried to negotiate a new path. He failed. The honesty in the word hurt more than any ready-made defense. Soon after, Noah came in with a new set of evidence. He had cross-referenced logs, access records, and times, and found small payments to employees positioned exactly in the areas where the sabotage had occurred. Open valve, reset locks, information leaks, oil on the spa stairs. There was an internal chain working to push the lodge toward collapse and to make things easier for whoever was buying panic from outside. Ethan arrived next with William Hart's medical records. He confirmed Evelyn's father had been under heavier sedation than prescribed. It was not definitive criminal proof, but it made the accident story even more obscene. Someone had weakened him under the appearance of care. Throughout the day, local stories started appearing on regional outlets. Crisis at Hart Lodge. Guest accident. Suspicious fire. New management emotionally unstable. The narrative was so neatly assembled it felt written before the events had even happened. Mabel brought the tablet to Eivelyn with the dry, expression of someone who already knew bad scandals usually came with good punctuation. The article painted her as an out-of-control daughter trying to hold up a tourism empire too large for her capabilities. The filthiest part was not the insinuation. It was the efficiency. Whoever had been feeding the press knew exactly which words cut deepest in a region where rich men still called female authority instability when it suited them. Caleb was the one who brought the next piece. He had already been investigating Silas for weeks, ever since noticing small village acquisitions made by companies that were born, bought, and disappeared suspiciously fast. That day, he appeared without his usual smile, an audio device in his hand. Noah had helped him recover fragments from the office's old system. The recording restored the missing end of her father's first tape. Eivelyn pressed play. William's voice came through the static to the point where everything had died before. This time, it continued. The man you think is going to protect you is the one they chose to make look guilty. The sentence rearranged the whole board. A man had been constructed to carry the blame in front of her. Maybe Graham, because he was Voss. Maybe Noah, because of the signature and the sentinel posture. Maybe someone else. Her father had not given her a name. He had left her a crueler problem. The obligation to see everything before deciding whom she would step onto. Survive. She spent the rest of the afternoon dismantling the sentence like someone cutting open a dead animal to find out whether poison still remained inside. The man you think is going to protect you is the one they chose to make look guilty. If Graham had been brought close to William and then left under the weight of the Voss name, he might have been the ideal culprit. If Noah, with the signature and the security role, emerged as the most obvious protective figure, he worked too. The cruelty of the message was precisely that it did not choose for her. William had forced his daughter to become better than everyone who had surrounded him. Better at reading people. Better at patience. Better at strategic cruelty. When Graham knocked on her door hours later, Eivelyn did not let him in. She only listened to his voice through the wood, saying Silas would probably accelerate the bank now that the fire had failed to erase the evidence. Noah appeared next with the information. That bell was already pressing for a new emergency risk meeting. Ethan, for his part, sent a pain pill and a terse recommendation that she eat something before collapsing on her feet. Caleb left word at the desk that two regional investors had old ties to Mercer. None of the four men spoke the same emotional language. All of them, however, pointed to the same enemy by nightfall. Eivelyn finally admitted to herself that she was exhausted enough to commit the kind of emotional arithmetic error that confuses who calms you with who deserves your trust. That night, the entire lodge seemed to move around her with a different sound. Not the sound of tourism operations, but the sound of people choosing sides without the courage to name the choice. Mabel came in twice with coffee, once with information about the press and once with the dry delicacy of someone who wanted to ask if Eivelyn was still holding together and knew the question would be refused. Noah brought up a stack of reports without insisting on conversation. Ethan sent soup through someone from the kitchen, which irritated and comforted her at the same time. Caleb appeared at her door, did not enter, and simply said a cornered man usually made the mistake of rushing victory. And Silas seemed rushed. Graham did not knock again, at the center of that flow of small presences. Eivelyn understood something else. It would not be enough to find out who had killed William. She also had to decide how to survive the kind of imperfect loyalty the mountain offered her. None of the men around her were clean. Noah had signed. Graham had stayed silent. Caleb had hidden part of his investigation until he had enough proof. Ethan knew little, but even the little he knew came from proximity built in silence. Even so, their sum might be the only force available against Mercer. It was an unpleasant conclusion, which probably meant it was true. That was exactly why she decided to gather them all in the same room the next day. Separately, each man carried his own shadow. Together, they would be forced to reflect one another. And she, at the center, would finally see where their versions stopped matching. Chapter 7. Her choice list. Then an hour later, Eivelyn decided to stop hearing each man separately. She sent for Noah, Ethan, Caleb, and Graham and called them to a meeting at 6 o'clock in the smaller room of the upper restaurant. Caleb asked whether she had any idea of the homicidal potential of that table. Eivelyn replied that was exactly why the meeting would be useful. They arrived one by one. Noah with his black folder and border-like sobriety. Ethan with the blue bag and the calm of someone who knew the price of collapse. Caleb with his humor mostly leashed and eyes to alert. Graham last, still carrying the shadow of the Voss name on his shoulders and the silent tension of an alpha, who understood when to step back. Eivelyn did not wait for any of them to start talking. She presented the restored sentence from her father and declared the end of half-truths. From that moment on, no one would hold back useful information to manage later. Noah opened the access records and explained how the service dock, laundry, boiler room, and old Carters formed a perfect circuit for anyone who knew the lodge from the inside. He showed tools used on the panels, recycled credentials, and blind spots chosen with intelligence. Ethan presented the medical data, soberly supporting the theory that William had been weakened by cumulative sedation. Caleb laid out the financial ties between Gerard Bell, the bank manager, and companies linked to Mercer's chain. When it was Gramps' turn, he finally gave them the full lupine reason behind the siege. The lodge was as much a territorial crown as a source of money. Arthur had wanted to reclaim it for the pack by force of historical right. Mercer had wanted to take it through engineered bankruptcy. The fact that the two goals converged explained the absurd amount of coordinated pressure placed on William. Eivelyn heard it all and decided the next step. The winter relief dinner, the village's charity event scheduled for 2 days later, would be the stage. She would invite Silas Mercer to publicly sponsor part of the evening. Men like him relaxed when they believed they had won too early. Bell would appear. So would the local press. It was the chance to expose the siege in public, with documentation, witnesses, and too many people present for the scandal to be buried easily. She assigned roles. Noah would handle access points, staff, and cameras. Caleb would map Bell, his phone, and any financial movement. Ethan would attend as the event's doctor, able to validate any physical sign of manipulation. Graham would be responsible for containing the lupine side of the problem. Any remaining Arthur loyalists or Voss pack members who might decide to turn charity into territorial intimidation. No one challenged the division. Maybe because it was finally clear she was no longer asking any man's permission on that mountain. Noah only asked how many exits she wanted blocked and how many left free. Enough for the enemy to think he still had a choice. Caleb wanted to know at what exact moment Bell should be pulled into the center. Ethan asked what the real risk of violence was. Graham asked only whether she intended to face Silas alone in front of the room. Eivelyn answered that she would step onto the stage alone. And that did not mean she would be without her people around her. The distinction mattered. She wanted all of them to understand it. When the meeting ended, each man left with a function and without the comfort of still pretending neutrality. Caleb told her at the door that trust suited her more than she liked to admit. Ethan recommended sleep, naturally ignored. Noah gathered up the folder and went to adjust building security. The next day, the lodge became a body preparing for battle. Noah changed credentials, redesigned access, and repositioned to trusted employees without informing middle management. He made it all look like normal maintenance. But Eivelyn knew he was building a labyrinth only the two of them would fully understand. Caleb vanished into the village for hours, then returned with names, times, and confirmation that Belle would arrive at the dinner accompanied by bank people, who preferred to look philanthropic rather than interested in the lodge's collapse. Ethan reviewed the beverage stock, circulated through the kitchen, spoke to the waitstaff, and left quiet instructions that nothing served to Eivelyn or near the documents should pass through untraceable hands. Graham, for his part, handled the side no contract could really reach. He spoke to older pack members, severed loyalties inherited from Arthur, and made it clear that any attempt to turn the dinner into a territorial display would be treated as a direct affront to the new Alpha. Eivelyn watched all of this without saying much. For the first time since her return, the lodge was beginning to breathe on her will, not the will of the men circling it. That shift, subtle as it was, returned a new kind of steadiness to her. There was still desire, doubt, anger, and grief, but above all there was an axis. By the time she went upstairs to get ready for the event, she already knew she would walk into that room not as a cornered victim, but as the owner of a trap built to close at the right second. On the afternoon before the event, Eivelyn noticed the unlikely coalition working in small gestures. Noah came to the office only to confirm the position of the cameras and, before leaving, set a protein bar on her desk as if nutrition were a matter of national security. Ethan came in minutes later under the excuse of checking the burn on her wrist, and took the opportunity to ask, without intruding, whether she intended to drink the wine served at the dinner or only pretend to. Caleb brought an informal map of the room's social circulation, drawn in pen on a napkin, and offered to distract any local authority figure who started scenting scandal too early. Graham arrived last, leaned against the doorframe, and said only that the pack was quiet. For anyone who knew Snowbound Pack, that was the equivalent of an operational miracle. Eivelyn said nothing out loud, but she noticed everything. Each of them offered protection in a different language. Noah, control. Ethan, care. Caleb, intelligence and useful noise. Graham, force held in check. None of that erased the particular danger each of them still represented. Yet together, they formed the first structure that did not push her directly toward sale, grief, or manipulation. Maybe that was what her father had feared and wanted at the same time when he wrote about her choice. The problem was not only choosing a man, it was choosing which forms of power would allow her to remain herself. Shortly before going upstairs to dress, Eivelyn crossed the lobby and saw Mabel rearranging the floral arrangements, with the cold concentration of someone who governed more than she appeared to. If any of those men ruin tonight, I'll poison the dessert myself, the receptionist said without looking up. Eivelyn nearly laughed. The sentence gave her the last push of normalcy she needed. There was home there. There were allies there. There was even humor, which on that mountain already counted as a form of resistance. Graham stayed alone before the fire. The tension changed shape again. Eivelyn made it clear that usefulness was not forgiveness, and function was not intimacy. Graham replied that the event was hers and Mercer would step into it believing he had cornered her. His hand touched her face with the irritating caution of a man who had learned that with Eivelyn, even care had to ask permission. The kiss they exchanged that time was brief, conscious, and worse because of it. Because it came less from urgency and more from choice. It solved nothing. It only made one thing clear, that if anything grew between them, it would be by her decision. Chapter 8. The Winter Manteau. Days later, the winter relief dinner opened its doors beneath elegant snow and well-dressed guests. The main hall glowed with candles, pine arrangements, expensive wine, and the false sense of safety that only influential people can carry into a charity event. Eivelyn wore a dark dress, a structured coat, and her father's watch on her wrist. Above all, she had the lethal calm of someone who had finally decided to play on her own board. Noah was already near the side entrance, almost invisible to anyone who did not know where to look. Ethan was speaking with an elderly guest by the fireplace, impeccable doctor in social mode. Caleb moved through the bar as if dangerous parties were his natural habitat. Graham watched the room beside the tall windows, too solid a presence to go unnoticed by anyone who understood the weight of a silent alpha. Silas Mercer entered exactly as that kind of man should. Impeccable, polished, confident. He found Eivelyn in the center of the room and followed when she led him to a side area, close enough to the village council to function as a display, distant enough from the main podium to look like privilege. Before either of them spoke, Eivelyn saw the calculation in his eyes. Silas assessed who stood near the bar, who sat at the council table, where the bank men were, and which exits remained most unobstructed. He was the same species of wolf Arthur would have despised out loud and respected in secret. The kind who preferred to bring prey down through financial balance sheets, rather than dirty his own hands. Eivelyn started softly. She thanked him for his generosity, his constant interest in the lodge's survival, the special attention he had given the debt, the bank's behavior, the internal fragilities, and the exact timing of the accidents. As she spoke, she watched him smile with that slight arrogance of men who think they are being celebrated. The smile changed when he noticed the turn in the speech. She accused him, at first in nearly private conversation, of knowing too much about the inside of the crisis. He called it well-dressed hysteria. Eivelyn replied that if she were a less occupied woman, she would throw the wine in his face and still call it charity. Caleb appeared at exactly the right moment to report that the bank men had arrived. Gerard Bell was with them. It was time, Mabel announced the hostess's remarks. Eivelyn stepped up to the small podium and thanked everyone for coming. She spoke about winter, the community, and what the lodge had endured. Then she dropped the politeness. She said there had been accidents, rumors, and too much hurry to call fate what had in fact been method. Then she offered special thanks to Silas Mercer for his persistent interest in the lodge's debt, cash flow, internal fragilities, and the rhythm of its ruin. The entire room understood this was no longer protocol. Bell tried to interrupt. Eivelyn disarmed him in front of everyone. Noah placed a folder on the council table containing logs, photographs, access records, and suspicious movements. Caleb brought the financial transfers linking Bell to structures associated with Mercer. Ethan presented William Hart's medical records, carefully supporting the hypothesis of elevated sedation in the days before his death. Silas tried to retreat to the classic thesis of the rich man to clean to dirty his own hands, claiming lower-level subordinates might have used his name improperly. Eivelyn replied that it was always fascinating how very rich men discovered the existence of autonomous subordinates. At the exact moment blood reached the linen, Bell visibly blanched when he heard his own name pass through the room, and the guest's murmur began to change in quality. From social curiosity, it turned into reputational calculation. That was when Graham stepped out from the back of the room and fully entered the conversation. In front of the village council, he acknowledged that Arthur Voss had pressured William Hart and treated territory as inherited. Right. He did not erase his father's name. He did not try to absolve the Voss pack. He said only what mattered. What Arthur had wanted by force, Mercer had tried to complete through debt, reputation, and infiltration. The statement stripped away the last veneer of neutrality from the night. After the first impact, The room's dynamics shifted almost visibly. The press guests stopped circulating with false discretion and began recording everything with nearly hungry attention. An investor couple exchanged glances too quickly to be mere curiosity. A village councilman seated near the fireplace straightened in his chair like a man who had just realized the evening's charitable speech had become a real power scene. The polished beauty of the event remained intact, but now it served only as a frame for the public display of rot. That was exactly what Eivelyn wanted. In Snowbound Pack, a scandal only becomes useful when it humiliates in front of the right audience. Silas still tried to reclaim the center of the scene in a low, elegant voice, asking whether Eivelyn truly intended to confuse a philanthropic dinner with an improvised tribunal. She answered in the same tone, reminding him that men like him usually wore philanthropy like perfume to hide the origin of their money and the smell of fear. Some guests looked away, others almost smiled. Belle, already contained by Noah, made it clear in every drop of sweat that he was beginning to understand that on this night, he would be sacrificed without much ceremony if it helped Mercer save his own skin. That was when the pack itself became a more visible presence. Some older members, invited by tradition, watched everything with the dangerous silence of people measuring consequences that were not only social, but hierarchical. When Graham took his place beside Eivelyn without stepping in front of her, the message ran through the room in a language that needed no human translation. The new alpha would not stand over her. He would stand beside her. To the village, that was politics. To wolves, it was a declaration of alignment. To Mercer, it was a complication he clearly had not expected to manage in front of so many witnesses. Belle tried to flee. Noah cut him off before the side exit. But in the middle of the chaos, another man moved. Harold Byrne, the lodge's longtime accountant, too discreet to have looked suspicious for years, ran with a thin folder under his arm. Caleb noticed first. Noah turned too. The folder dropped for a second, and the original transfer document slipped out onto the floor. The whole room saw Harold lift his eyes to Eivelyn, white with panic. In front of the village, the bank, Mercer, the press, and the pack, he confessed the first part of the truth. It had not been Mercer who entered the office that last night. It had not been Voss either. It had been the lodge's own accountant. After Harold let out that first confession, the room seemed to tilt. Not physically, but morally. Some guests stepped back as if guilt were contagious. Others leaned forward with the social hunger of people who smell a headline. Silas remained still, handsome, and cold. But Eivelyn saw clearly the instant his control stopped being certainty and became defense. Belle, already cornered by Noah, looked at Mercer with the small expression of men who always believe the rich boss will save them from their own servility. Graham stayed in the center long enough for everyone to understand the choice he was making. He would not protect his surname above the truth. Not that night. That gesture, perhaps more even than his speech, made some of those present change sides in silence. An alpha choosing to publicly break with his father's inheritance was worth, in a town like Snowbound, more than half a dozen certificates to anyone who understood the weight of a word given before the pack. Harold managed to escape only because chaos is always the best cover for lesser guilty men, and it was exactly the lesser dimension of his guilt that made everything even more disgusting. Mercer was ambition. Arthur had been deformed inheritance. Harold, however, was home, familiarity, proof that the final blow to the heart of a property almost always comes from someone who knows the way to the door without having to ask. Chapter 9. The Mountain Ancestors room exploded into motion after the partial confession. Belle was sweating, Silas was calculating damage. The guests divided between moral horror and the social pleasure of watching someone important fall. In that interval, Harold jerked free, recovered the folder, and ran down the side corridor. Eivelyn went after him without waiting for anyone. She knew the mountain well enough to predict the direction. Harold did too, and there was only one place high enough, isolated enough, and old enough for a guilty man to try to breathe while clutching an original document, the old observatory. She cut across the North Trail and gained ground, while the others were still trying to organize the chaos back at the lodge. Almost an hour later, she saw Harold climbing to the observatory platform, panting, snow coating his coat, the folder tucked beneath his arm like the last vital organ in his body. "It's over," she shouted when she got close enough. Harold turned, startled. Under moonlight and wind, he no longer wore the neutral face of the old accountant. He looked like a man consumed by years of guilt patched together with mediocre justifications. Eivelyn ordered him to stop and talk. Harold gave in little by little, perhaps because he was finally too tired to keep lying. He said William had discovered the financial draining too early, the contracts with empty companies, the siege closing around the debt. Arthur Voss had supplied fear, Mercer had supplied money, but the man who had adjusted the books, the flow, and the breaches from the inside had been him, Harold, trusted man of the house, who had convinced himself he was saving the lodge by allowing a controlled transfer. "I thought that if it happened the right way, at least the Hart name would stay on the front," he confessed. "It was the miserable logic of domestic traders. They do not see themselves as monsters, but as sensible men managing damage." Eivelyn dragged him back to the truth. He had sold her father for fear, money, and self-deception. When pressured, Harold told the rest. William had called him to the office on the final night. He already suspected enough. He spoke about the second copy, swore he would not sign, and said he would leave everything prepared so Eivelyn could bury all of them afterward. Harold saw the recorder, heard part of the message, tried to take the tape. They argued. William was already slower from the accumulated sedation. There was a struggle. There was a shove. William fell. "I didn't mean for him to die," he whispered. "But you chose the act that killed him," Eivelyn said as she recorded the entire confession on her phone. Full name, money received, role in the financial siege, pressure from Arthur, financing from Mercer, fight in the office, fall, cover dash up. During the confession, Harold cried only once, and it disturbed her more than it should have, not because it stirred pity, but because the tear came far too late, on a face that had spent years signing false numbers, hiding diversions, and living beside William almost every day. The image destroyed any comforting fantasy that monsters always announce themselves as such. Sometimes they are soft-spoken men who know the wine cellar, the linen inventory, and your birthday. When Eivelyn forced him to say out loud that he had pushed William, the observatory went so still that even the wind seemed to hesitate. Noah and Graham remained motionless behind her out of brutal respect for the center of that scene. Ethan, farther back, was already preparing with his whole body the readiness of someone who might have to save a man who deserved no emotional salvation, only medical survival. Caleb watched with the rare expression of a man who had no joke available. That, Eivelyn realized, was the whole mountain witnessing the moment when her father's death stopped being elegant abstraction and took on the unbearable weight of an ordinary gesture. It was also in that instant that she understood why William had hidden so many clues in layers, not because he doubted his daughter's intelligence, but because he knew a truth like that, delivered all at once, would crush anyone. The fragmented clues had allowed Eivelyn to reach Harold not as a broken woman, but as a sharpened one. Maybe that had been the last real protection her father had managed to give her. When he finished, she demanded the folder. Harold hesitated, prisoner of his own guilt and fear. He handed it over only when Eivelyn told him that dying there without giving her the document would turn his guilt into one last service to the powerful men who had used him. The instant Harold yielded, the snow-covered wood groaned beneath his foot. The observatory had an old walkway, rotten under the white layer. Behind Eivelyn, Noah, Graham, Caleb, and Ethan had finally arrived, but remained at the right distance. At that moment, the scene still belonged to her. Harold made one last movement, whether to fall or throw himself. Eivelyn reacted fast, kicking the base of the broken railing. The piece struck his knee, throwing him inward, not into the drop. Noah lunged and pinned him. Graham yanked Eivelyn back by the arm before the next board gave way. Caleb still had enough breath to call it alpine crisis management with erotic tension. Ethan checked whether Harold was still whole enough to answer for everything. On the way down, Graham spoke of his own name like an open wound. My name is still going to bleed in this story. It will, Eivelyn replied, but it won't decide the ending on its own. Chapter 10. The mountain nose thrust happened with speed and impact. The recording of Harold's confession was duplicated before any lawyer had even properly woken up. The accountant was taken into formal custody. Gerard Bell tried to distance himself from the scheme, but his financial ties to Mercer were already too exposed. Silas did what men like him always do when the ice cracks. He denied, lamented deviations, spoke of cooperation, blamed smaller pieces, offered civilized outraged that it worked for a short time. Caleb delivered to the press, the council, and the local attorneys the chain of payments, intermediary companies, and links connecting Bell to Mercer's financial structure. Noah presented logs, access records, and the internal engineering of the sabotage. Ethan upheld the medical evidence that made the accident story more obscene by the day. Eivelyn placed the original transfer document on the table and stated, before enough witnesses, that William Hart had been coerced by a system made of inherited fear and purchased hunger. Mercer did not fall all at once, but he lost ground, margin, and narrative. The bank opened an internal investigation. Investors withdrew. The press discovered, belatedly, that a scandal with documents was worth more than a well-dressed rumor. Arthur Voss was already dead. Even so, his legacy received the public burial it deserved. The rebuilding of Hart Lodge did not happen in one beautiful gesture. It happened in ugly, repeated, absolutely necessary tasks. Contracts to review, employees to reevaluate, suppliers to win back, bookings to steady, and entire hallways to disinfect of the metaphorical smell of intrusion. Eivelyn spent days arriving early at her father's old office and leaving late, no longer to follow clues left in crumbs, but to decide which part of the house deserved to remain and which had to be torn out by the root. Mabel became an administrative arm. Noah turned security into a new system. Ethan acted as the man of crisis and health. Caleb as an inconveniently effective radar for any rumor that might start growing again in the village. And Graham sustained on the pack's side the break he had promised in public. There was also invisible work. The work of relearning the lodge without her father's presence hidden in every object. Eivelyn reviewed his favorite bar, chose which paintings would remain in the old wing, had the office restored without erasing the essential marks, and on one especially cruel late afternoon, listened to William's tapes in full for the last time before locking them in a new safe. Not because she wanted to forget, but because she finally wanted to stop being guided only by a dead man's message. Her father would still live there, just no longer as a hand tugging every decision by the sleeve. There were bureaucratic days, hard and necessary. Lawyers, depositions, audits, internal reorganization, quiet dismissals, and other very loud ones. Mabel ran the front desk as if chairing a civilizational reconstruction. Noah redesigned access, keys, and circulation patterns. Ethan watched Eivelyn with the clinical and lupine instinct of someone who knew how to identify exhaustion before the body admitted it. Caleb, between one report and another, continued supplying inconvenient lightness at the exact moments. The house threatened to become nothing but smoke and paper. Graham appeared by choice at the final meeting with the village council and, in his capacity as the new alpha of the Voss pack, formally declared that the clan renounced any historical, territorial, or administrative claim over Hart Lodge. It was not absolution for the blood that came before him. It was a rupture, and coming from a man like Graham, it carried real weight. Days later, Eivelyn sat at her father's desk and signed a new agreement. Dry, clear, and without excessive poetry. It established winter access, logistical cooperation in emergencies, complete exclusion of property interference, and formal recognition of Hart Lodge's full autonomy. Graham read it, signed it, and handed back the pen. "I never thought peace would come in for pages this unromantic," he said. "Romance is how some people end up selling property to the wrong men," she answered. That night, Mabel forced the useful men to have dinner before they went back to being trouble. Noah remained sober as a boarder. Ethan observed everyone's exhaustion level like a doctor and wolf healer who knew the price of excess. Caleb made jokes about charity, banking, and the sweat of the local financial system. Eivelyn laughed more than she expected. At one point, Noah lifted his glass of water and said William Hart had been a difficult man. Eivelyn agreed and added that no man who resists alone deserves the ending he got. After dinner, Noah left first, by discipline. Ethan touched her shoulder lightly and wished her a night without smoke. Caleb lingered a second longer, said women who beat rich men should charge admission, and kissed her forehead just to annoy her. The gesture earned him a low insult and an involuntary smile. Then there was Graham. He found her in the side quarter by the window while snow erased the day's marks outside. The silence between them was never empty, only concentrated. Eivelyn then said what she needed to say, whole without bad metaphor. Her father had believed Graham might stop blood. He had not stopped it. Even so, he had not been the man chosen to look guilty. What existed between them would not come from his name, or her need, or any territory. It would come from her decision. "I choose you because I want to," she said. "Not because I need shelter. Not because the mountain demands it. One choose you because when everything got smaller, you stayed the right size and didn't try to reduce me." Graham received the words with that gray gaze that always seemed to hold winter, and something warmer beneath it. When Eivelyn pulled him by the coat and kissed him, there was no more anger, only decision. The kiss came whole, firm, less urgent than the one in the crypt, and because of that, truer. It was not a fairy tale. Neither of them was built for one. It was an honest ceasefire. Days later, Hart Lodge officially reopened. No exaggerated spectacle, no hysteria, no begging for absolution. The main entrance was clean. Bookings were returning to normal. The staff had been reorganized, and the central fireplace burned where it always should have burned. Snow fell softly over the cabins. The mountains remained there, ancient, arrogant, and larger than all of them. The reopening of Hart Lodge also required a quiet adjustment in the way Eivelyn looked at the 5 men who had crossed the crisis with her. Noah remained the kind of difficult loyalty that does not offer itself in beautiful words, only in steady presence at the right door and the exact right moment. Ethan remained a possible pause in the middle of chaos, a man and wolf healer capable of reminding her that strength is not measured only in the moment of attack. Caleb went on, bringing irreverence, information, and a kind of teasing tenderness that refused a definitive label. Silas, even outside the main game, remained as a living reminder that luxury predators never disappear completely. They only retreat and wait for another winter. And Graham, with all the weight of the Voss name still bleeding in the margins, began to occupy a new place, less simple and more true. The place of the man who could stay close without trying to shrink her space. In the days leading up to the reopening, Graham accompanied her on late inspections of the property, not as a tutor, not as some hidden owner of anything, but as someone willing to know the house in peace after knowing it in ruin. On one of those nights, they stopped at the south overlook, where the wind came loaded with fine snow and the scent of pine. Graham said, without romance, that becoming alpha after Arthur felt less like a coronation and more like endless moral cleanup. Evelyn answered that inheritances rarely ask permission before collecting their debt. The conversation ended in a comfortable silence, the kind that no longer needs to prove anything to anyone. Maybe that was the most intimate thing of all. When the lodge reopened, the staff sensed before the guests that something essential had changed. It was not only the absence of the saboteurs or the new security. It was the posture of the house itself. The building seemed to have recognized again who was in command. Mabel, from her station at the front desk, watched Evelyn cross the lobby early one morning and muttered that the entire decor looked prettier, simply because the owner finally seemed determined to stay. Caleb heard her and said that was the administrative version of a romance. Noah pretended not to find it funny. Ethan smiled sideways. Graham, from the far side of the room, simply held Evelyn's gaze for a full second. And in that second there was more truth than in any exaggerated promise. Evelyn stood on the balcony for a moment before going back inside. She touched her father's watch by reflex. Old habit. This time, though, not from insecurity, only from memory. She looked at the falling snow without fear. On the first truly quiet night after the reopening, Evelyn went back alone to her father's old office, not to search for a clue, but to close a ritual. She opened the drawer where the first tape had been hidden, touched the wood for a moment, and left William Hart's watch there on the desktop for a few seconds. Then she fastened it back onto her wrist. She would not speak out loud to the dead. She did not need to. The lodge was already too full of them, and yet for the first time, her father's memory did not feel like an order. It felt like company. When she stepped out of the office, she found Graham in the dark corridor, leaning against the wall like a man who had learned how to wait without invading. He asked if she was all right. Evelyn answered that she was better than William would ever have believed possible. At that point in the story, Graham smiled, rare, small, almost feral. He said old Hart would probably have had 3 technical criticisms about how they had solved the case and a 4th about the way the final paperwork had been organized. That made her laugh for real, maybe because it was exactly the kind of affectionate cruelty her father would have practiced. The two of them walked to the balcony in silence. Snow fell lightly. Down below, the lodge breathed in relative peace. Graham did not touch her right away. He simply stayed close, sharing the cold, the space, and the moment. Evelyn realized then that this was the fundamental difference between him and the other men who had tried to circle her. Graham had the size to occupy everything. Even so, He had chosen not to occupy more than she offered. In the end, that was worth more than any promise spoken in the heat of urgency. When she kissed him again under the balcony's low light and the distant sound of the fire, inside the hall, there was no immediate war to justify the gesture. No chase, no flames, only choice. Only the mature and still dangerous awareness that loving a man that large would always mean accepting risk, but not the risk of being reduced, the risk of being seen whole. And after everything, that no longer frightened her the way it once had. Now the mountain knew exactly who ruled there.